Hello, students. This video is going to look into the concept of niches and also this other interesting process that we call adaptive radiation, which is basically a way that we see large-scale patterns of diversification unfolding on the evolutionary field. And this turns out to be a two pretty important concepts to understand in the context of the formation of biodiversity. So when we're talking about niches, what the heck are we talking about? This word niche gets thrown around all the time. In fact, you might not even hear it pronounced niche. You might hear it pronounced niche. It's kind of up to you how you want to say it. But basically, the concept of a niche is very tightly related to the kind of environment that can support a species. And really specifically, when we're talking about this kind of an environment, we're talking about something called a fundamental ecological niche. Now, what is this? Well, different biologists over time have come up with different definitions of a niche, and one is not necessarily more correct than the other. They just kind of describe different ways that we can understand the kind of environment that supports a species, or the ways that we can describe the kind of environment that supports a particular species. And so one of the earliest niche concepts that was proposed comes from Joseph Grinnell during the 20th century. And basically, Grinnell defined a niche as all aspects of a habitat that a species uses. So this is sort of intuitive. A species has certain functional traits, and it uses those functional traits in order to exploit certain aspects of its environment. And those specific traits and those specific aspects of the environment might be good at defining the species niche, what it's doing. Charles Elton came along a little bit later and said, well, maybe a niche should be more clearly defined as the role that a species plays in an ecosystem. So ecosystems are complicated, but basically different kinds of species can do different things in ecosystems. For example, plants do photosynthesis. We might call that their ecological niche, performing photosynthesis, getting energy from the sun and producing sugars that other organisms can feed upon. Or the other organisms that feed upon these plants, they're playing different roles in the ecosystems. Or even things like pollinators are playing very, very specific roles in ecosystems that have very intricate interactions with plants, and maybe higher level predators that are feeding upon different animals are performing yet another role in an ecosystem. Or things like fungi that are decomposers and are breaking down dead organic material and making some of the molecules and some of the nutrients that are available or that exist in that material available to other organisms. That might be yet another role that species can play. And so that's a different way of looking at a species niche. There's also this more recent concept called an n-dimensional hypervolume, which was proposed by G. Evelyn Hutchinson more recently. And an n-dimensional hypervolume sounds kind of crazy, but basically what we're saying is that there are n dimensions. That is some number of dimensions. It could be 1 dimension, 2 dimensions, 3 dimensions, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, maybe dozens and dozens of dimensions of different environmental factors that are dictating whether or not a species can occur within this thing we call the fundamental ecological niche. And so these kinds of factors are things like perhaps temperature, perhaps precipitation, perhaps the availability of nutrients, perhaps the availability of sunlight, perhaps salinity, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And if we think about species distributions realistically, we can start to see how these factors are piling up pretty fast. And it's kind of hard to describe a species in fundamental and ecological niche in terms of simply just one factor. It makes a lot more sense to describe it in terms of n factors. So that's kind of what the concept of an n-dimensional hypervolume is. It's the complete set of factors that we can use to understand a species' fundamental ecological niche. And a species' fundamental ecological niche really is theoretical. It's kind of these different ideas we have about where species can occur, what aspects of a habitat might they use, what roles in the environment might they play, what kind of factors might dictate where they can occur. So there are these different ideas being tossed around that explain a kind of complicated concept. So one of the most important factors in understanding a species' fundamental ecological niche is understanding what a species' physiological range of tolerance is to these various environmental variables, such as temperature or precipitation, etc. And the range of these different variables that kind of occur along gradients turn out to be pretty important for the distribution of species. And we can kind of start using them to describe a species niche. And so basically what this framework shows is that there is this, again, this gradient going from some low value of an environmental variable to some high value of an environmental variable. In this case, we have temperature on the x-axis as an example. And then on the y-axis, we have the frequency or the number of individuals who can survive those conditions. And as it turns out, most individuals seem to do best at intermediate values of this environmental variable, temperature, for example. Intermediate temperatures. We would call this the range of the optimum, and this is where a particular species has the greatest abundance of individuals. And so more intermediate temperatures are supporting more individuals. When the temperature starts to get too hot, we see this population starting to enter a zone of what we call physiological stress, where not a lot of individuals are adapted to dealing with that stress or carry the proper mutations to enable them to deal with that stress. And ultimately, there comes a point where, say, temperature becomes so hot that this species is completely absent from those kinds of environments. And they have sort of reached their upper limit of tolerance. And at that point, beyond that point, I should say, we would call that the zone of intolerance. On the opposite end of this sort of scale, we see something very similar where temperatures maybe are a little bit too cold. And so not a lot of individuals in this population are able to survive cooler temperatures. They don't have adequate mutations or they haven't acclimated to these conditions. And so once again, we have another zone of physiological stress, except this zone of physiological stress is cold-induced stress, whereas this zone of physiological stress is heat-induced stress. And of course, we have a lower limit of this tolerance and also, again, a zone of intolerance. And so this sort of framework, which is relatively simple and sort of hypothetical, basically gives us a prediction of the area where we would expect species to occur based on their physiological range of tolerance. There's a range of conditions which they can tolerate. And again, it seems like most individuals are able to tolerate an intermediate value of this particular environmental factor. Now, temperature is just one example. Again, this could be precipitation. This could be sunlight. This could be the availability of nutrients going from low to high, salinity going from low to high, pH going from low to high. Any of these factors really could be used to try to describe the fundamental ecological niche of a species. And it seems apparent that the easiest way to evaluate a species' fundamental ecological niche is by just using one variable in one-dimensional space. And so we could kind of start looking at how different species have different ranges of tolerance to different conditions. Thus, they have different fundamental niches. And this hypothetical graph here shows a situation where we have two species with slightly overlapping niches that are related to their tolerance to a range of temperatures. Again, going from low temperature to high temperature. And we see on this y-axis the frequency or the number of individuals who can survive at those temperatures. And we have our two species A and B. And it's probably evident from looking at this graph that species A and species B have kind of different fundamental niches. They have a different range of they have different ranges of physiological tolerance related to temperature. And this kind of allows them to be able to occupy two very different ecological niches. Species A seems like its ecological niche is cooler, whereas species B seems to be able to tolerate warmer conditions. And so this is a simplified hypothetical example, but this kind of gets at an explanation of why it is species occur where they do and why they might co-occur or why they might not co-occur. And that process is directly related to their physiological range of tolerance. And that is, again, a sort of description of their fundamental niche. Now, this gets a little bit more complicated, but we can more specifically start to evaluate a species' fundamental niche using multiple variables, kind of like this idea of an n-dimensional hypervolume. I know that thing sounds crazy, but using one environmental factor to describe a species niche is only going to go so far because there are likely to be other factors. So let's say now, instead of only looking at temperature, going from cold to hot, we also look at moisture, going from very wet to very dry. And this sort of framework in this graph is describing more nuanced aspects of the environment, where we have these sort of cool, wet conditions here, and these sort of cool, dry conditions here, and these sort of hot, wet conditions here. And we know from our understanding of Earth's geography that different combinations of these factors exist all over the place. There are regions of the Earth that are indeed cold and wet. There are regions of the Earth that are indeed cold and dry. And there are regions of the Earth that are indeed hot and wet. And so we can now get a little bit more specific view at how our species A and B, the same sort of species we were looking at here, are responding to these different environmental gradients and how this affects the overlap of their ecological niches. And these little bubbles here are kind of illustrating how much fitness either of these two species are able to gain in with respect to these two different environmental conditions. And in this particular example, it seems like species A has highest fitness where temperature is a little bit cool and moisture is relatively wet. And as the conditions start to become drier and warmer, species A starts to have a little bit lower fitness. So there's this real sweet spot where species A seems to do best, and that's directly related to its physiological range of tolerance to these conditions. Likewise, we can say the same thing about species B. Species B seems to do better in slightly drier conditions compared to species A, and in slightly warmer conditions compared to species A. And species B appears to have its highest fitness, again, in this sweet spot at just the right combination of moisture and temperature that are influencing its ability to successfully survive and reproduce. Now we can make we can make this situation even more complicated by adding a third variable, in this case, sunlight. And this sunlight axis, if you can use your imagination, is sort of coming out of the page in a third dimension. So think of temperature as being one dimension, moisture being a second dimension, and sunlight being a third dimension. And in this case, now we're representing the relative fitnesses of our two different species using spheres, which are three-dimensional objects compared to these circles that we looked at previously. And so this is getting giving us a closer approximation at how these two species are responding to the combination of these three factors: temperature, sunlight, and moisture. Again, temperature going from cold to hot, moisture going from wet to dry, and sunlight going from shady to bright. And this is not too much different than what we saw in the previous example. Species A seems to have its highest fitness when temperatures are relatively cool and conditions are relatively moist and conditions are relatively more shady. Whereas in contrast, species B seems to have its highest fitness when temperatures are a little bit warmer, relatively speaking, and a little bit drier, relatively speaking, and a little bit brighter. And it's these combinations of these different factors that are getting us at an understanding of why it is they occur where they do. And this, again, is a description of this thing called their fundamental niche. And this might really explain why it is that species A is where it is and species B is where it is. Perhaps species A is more of a forest species, for example, and perhaps species B is more of an arid land or a desert species that can deal with warmer and drier and sunnier conditions. Now, again, when we talked about that crazy thing called an n-dimensional hypervolume, we really are getting at this idea that if we can sort of throw every single possible environmental factor, sort of throw the kitchen sink at this, maybe we'll get a better picture of where a particular species really does have where its fundamental niche does exist, which is to say, in other terms, sort of where does a particular species have suitable habitat? And scientists do this using something called species distribution models. And these models are basically computer generated models. They use machine learning techniques. If you've ever heard of that, if you haven't, that's okay. But it's basically feeding a computer a whole bunch of information about where species are and a whole bunch of information about the conditions in those locations. And then the computer um, gets trained and makes a whole lot of educated guesses about where that species might have suitable habitat, and that's sort of like saying that's where the species has its fundamental niche. And so these two maps here are showing a comparison of habitat suitability generated using such models for two species of a plant in the genus Ceanothus, which if you've never heard of, it's very common in California. And in this case, we're comparing two sister taxa, Ceanothus pauciflorus and Ceanothus perplexans. They are very closely related, but as it turns out, their fundamental ecological niches are not exactly identical. And perhaps this reflects differences in their distributions. And probably this has something to do with their level of evolutionary relatedness. And so basically what we're seeing on these maps is this color coding, where if the color in a particular area is very light or very pinkish, that means that habitat suitability is very low. And as we go to increasingly warmer colors, habitat suitability is going up. And as we get to the really dark green colors, this is where habitat suitability is the highest for these species. And so if we look at the map, we can see areas where there are these light colors. Those are probably areas of not very suitable habitat for this particular species, areas where this species doesn't really have a fundamental niche. And these areas that are really more greenish, that represent areas where, or places where this species has a very high habitat suitability, and where this species fundamental ecological niche exists. And we can see the same thing on this map on the right, which is instead for this species. And what we see when we compare them again is that the distribution of suitable habitat for the two species is not the same. And again, this probably reflects their evolutionary histories. And in this case, by the way, 19 different climate variables have been applied to this computer model to generate these probability maps. So instead of just looking at one variable, two variables, three variables, now we're generating this very, very complicated situation where we're getting at a better picture of how we can take all the possible information we have about these organisms and use it to predict what their niche is. And so trying to understand how this looks in 3 dimensions isn't terribly difficult, graphically speaking, but trying to understand how this looks in more than 3 dimensions is very challenging for our minds. And in fact, trying to understand how this is going on in 19 different dimensions is even more mind-blowing for us to really understand, especially in a graphical sense. And so in this case, we rely on these computer models, and we sort of let the computer do the behind the scenes calculations and give us this sort of estimate. And so this is a tool that has become very, very useful to ecologists and evolutionary biologists for understanding why species occur where they do and where they potentially could occur in the future. Now, as it turns out, and this might not be too surprising, species might not always necessarily occupy their fundamental ecological niche. And this can happen for a multitude of reasons. Things like different biotic interactions could prevent species from occurring where they have suitable habitat. Things like perhaps competition with other species that share a similar niche. Things like perhaps predation upon species. Things perhaps like maybe the availability of pollinators, if we're talking about plants. Maybe plants have suitable habitat in a bunch of places, but their pollinating species don't occur in those areas, and so the plants don't tend to occur in those areas either. or things like disturbance. Maybe a particular species could have suitable habitat in a certain area, but that area was exposed to wildfire or flood. And so the area where that species could have become established is not suitable. It has not been able to do so because of these different factors. And so this leads us to the idea that species, even though they do have fundamental ecological niches, they really tend to more often occupy something we call their realized ecological niche. And so there's this whole range of different environments where species might be able to occur, which is we kind of see here based on our color coding. But if you look at all these dark green dots on these maps, we see that, well, these dark green dots represent occurrences of either of these two species. What we see as these species don't always occur where they have suitable habitat. And that might happen for these different reasons. And so species, again, are really occurring in a realized ecological niche, a place where they realistically can become established and sort of undergo their normal life history. And we can look at this example on this graph, which now shows 3 different species. And we're going to look at just 2 environmental factors for sake of simplicity that they are responding to. And so again, we have temperature on this x-axis going from cold to hot. Maybe you shouldn't even call it an x-axis, we'll just call it an axis. And then moisture on this axis going from wet to dry. And again, we have our same species A and same species B that are responding to this, much in the same way that we saw here. And so maybe these 2 species tend to have their highest fitness, where there's a happy combination of temperature and moisture. But now we're going to add species C into the mix. And it looks like species C is kind of tolerant in these conditions in a broader sense when compared to either species A or species B. And in areas where the fundamental niches of these species overlap, there might be things like competition. And perhaps, let's say, for example, species C seems to be pretty resilient. It has sort of a broader range of physiological tolerance when compared to species A and species B. So theoretically speaking, in areas where species A and species C co-occur, and they're both responding to similar temperature and moisture conditions, maybe species C can outcompete species A because it's a little bit better at dealing with variation in these conditions. Likewise, maybe in areas where species C and species B tend to co-occur, species C is a little bit better at dealing with the conditions because it has a broader range of physiological tolerance, and it might potentially be able to outcompete species B. So again, even though there are areas where species A and species B have suitable habitat with respect to temperature and moisture, for example, if species C tends to occur in those areas, species A and species B might have a very, very difficult time becoming established simply because of competition. And so this leads species A and species B into their realized ecological niches, which basically takes the whole fundamental ecological niche and trims it down to a smaller piece where the species actually can become established and actually can occur in reality. Now, these competitive ecological interactions kind of lead to a couple different outcomes. And so we can take yet another hypothetical example here where we have 2 pairs of species, 1 and 2, 1 and 2. And we can look at two of these possible outcomes where we have time on these x-axes and basically both of these y-axes showing the abundance of individuals or the frequency of individuals. How many of them are there? And so in one scenario, we can have a situation where species 1 and species 2 are co-occurring in the same environment, but species 1 is just a lot better at dealing with that environment when compared to species 2. And over time, species 2's numbers starts to go up, their numbers start to go up a little bit, but then because of competition with species 1, their numbers decline rapidly to the point where they just can't occur in this environment. They cannot co-occur with species 1. And species 1's numbers are taking off until it reaches some sort of stable population size. This is a situation that we would call competitive exclusion. Because of competition between species 1 and species 2 is being excluded from being able to occupy its fundamental niche, and species 1 has effectively outcompeted it. The sort of different scenario that we can look at is something called stable coexistence. So once again, we have species 1 and 2 who come to co-occur a certain environment where they both have suitable habitat at a certain point in time. And over time, we see both of their numbers go up. And again, species 2 reaches a point where their numbers kind of start to drop off over time, but this time, in this situation, they don't go away completely. And species 1's numbers, of course, are raising once again to some stable population size, but the two species are able to co-occur in this environment. And that's typically happening because of this thing we call resource partitioning. So stable coexistence between, say, two co-occurring species could happen perhaps because species 1 is able to do pretty good at using certain resources that are available in this environment. And species 2 instead is able to do pretty good at using some different resources in the same environment. So by virtue of species 1 being able to occupy a certain nuanced niche in the environment, maybe a certain role in the environment, and species 2 kind of occupying a certain different nuanced niche and performing maybe slightly different roles in the environment, they are able to co-occur. They are able to coexist with one another. And this is an interesting fact of nature that often happens, that allows ecosystems to kind of start to become complex, where you have different species in ecosystems that use different resources, perform different roles, and are able to evade competition in this way. And we see something very similar going on with Darwin's finches. And what we see with Darwin's finches is that they have experienced some level of phenotypic divergence, specifically in terms of their beak morphologies, beak depths, beak lengths. And this is probably something that has, these are probably adaptations that these different bird species have acquired in response to competition. In some cases. And so we can look at these two species of finches, Geospiza fuliginosa and Geospiza fortis, and we can look at two different interesting situations where these birds occur on the Galapagos Islands. And so the first example shows a situation where we're looking at the beak morphology, beak depth, if you will, of these two different species. So the blue bars show Geospiza fuliginosa and the white bars show Geospiza fortis. These little carets are kind of showing the average beak depth that has been measured in this situation. And on the y-axis, again, we're seeing basically the frequency of individuals with those beak depths. And so Geospiza fuliginosa seems to have slightly smaller beak depths on this one island of Los Hermanos. And this other species of Geospiza, Geospiza fortis, seems to have higher beak depths on this other island. But if we look carefully at the plot, we can see that if we look at Geospiza from Los Hermanos and we look at Geospiza from Daphne Major, and they are two different species, there's overlap in their beak depths. So, for example, we could find individual Geospiza fuliginosa birds on Los Hermanos that have kind of large beak depths, similar to those as the beak depths of Geospiza fortis found on Daphne Major. And likewise, we can find individual birds of Geospiza fortis who have kind of smaller beak depths on this island that are really similar to the beak depths of birds on Los Hermanos. So these are two different species of birds that occur on two separate islands. And these are separate populations. If we instead look at coexisting populations, we see something very interesting. These are the same two bird species that both co-occur on one island called Santa Cruz. And on this island, we can see that these beak morphologies are not really going to overlap so much when these two bird species occur in sympatry, when they occur in the same environment. Now we see that selection has driven adaptations in Geospiza fuliginosa that are favoring smaller beak depths, and that the opposite is sort of true for Geospiza fortis, where selection has favored larger beak depths in them. And we think this is probably because when they have come together to co-occur, they are competing for the same resources. And so if they can start to experience selection that allows them to acquire sort of very different beak depths, such as we kind of saw in this example here, where species A and species B are kind of doing two different things. If these species can evolve to do two different things in the same environment, they'll both be able to co-occur. They will experience this thing we call stable coexistence. Again, is an example of resource partitioning. So to reiterate, when these species don't co-occur, doesn't really matter. Selection can favor really overlapping beak morphologies because these two bird species aren't coming across each other. They're not competing for resources because they occur on different separate islands. But when they do occur and they are competing for resources, natural selection is becoming a very strong force, causing this divergence, this phenotypic divergence between their beak morphologies, between these characteristics in these birds that are very important for survival. And this is a process that we call character displacement. The characters of either of these two birds have been displaced. They've been changed, altered by available resources in the environment, competition for those resources, and natural selection for different kinds of traits that allow them to experience stable coexistence. So as it turns out, these kind of processes like competitive exclusion, stable coexistence, character displacement, they can really lead to an interesting process of diversification unfolding if there are variable niches available in the environment. And sometimes this has played out in some very interesting ways to cause widespread diversification of lineages. And we would call that widespread diversification of lineages and adaptive radiation. Now, there are two key ingredients for an adaptive radiation to occur. Again, one is the variability of different fundamental ecological niches for species to sort of diverge into. And these species are kind of required to possess novel innovations. And so we could think of, for sake of simplicity, variation in beak depth amongst these two bird species sort of being like novel innovations. Having a sort of smaller beak depth is an innovation for this particular species of Geospiza. Having a sort of larger beak depth is a novel innovation for this species of Geospiza. And we can see that's true when they come to coexist with one another. They really diverge in sympatry, again, in the same environment. And so in environments that are very complicated ecologically, again, with lots of different kinds of niches that can be occupied. And if a type of species or a lineage of species comes to occupy those environments, and those species start to evolve different kinds of novel traits, there can be a burst of diversification. And probably the most classic example of this is seen with the cichlid fishes of Lake Victoria in Africa. And what we basically know is that a single ancestral species or a single ancestral population of cichlids colonized this lake at some time a while back. And pretty rapidly, this single species has radiated into 16 different species. And this is kind of a complicated phylogeny showing how we know, based on genetic evidence, based on DNA data, that there is very distinctive differentiation amongst all of these different forms of cichlids. And each of these different cichlids has evolved certain traits that allow it to exploit certain niches in this lake. And it turns out this lake, of course, is very ecologically complex, and that has facilitated this lineage to be able to diversify in such a really extreme way, going from, again, just one species to many, many species that all not only look quite different from one another, but are reproductively isolated from one another. So they're not really mating with one another. And they're all kind of doing very, very different things in the environment. And they're all having a lot of success at this. And so the process of diversification is really, again, being driven by chance adaptations and the availability of different niches in the environment where those adaptations are favorable. And if those two combinations come together in just the right way, we can see diversification happening. And this is just one example. We can look at the Hawaiian honeycreepers, which is yet another pretty interesting example. These are birds that look a lot like hummingbirds in some cases. They look like some other kinds of birds as well. But as it turns out, these birds have evolved all kinds of different traits amongst different lineages that really all came from a common ancestor, shown here on this graph. This is basically a phylogeny. And so this phylogeny represents time on its sort of x-axis, going from a long, long time ago to the present time. And we can see that a long, long time ago, there was only one species of honeycreeper that occurred in this particular environment, which is taking place on the Hawaiian Islands. Now, just to make it clear, if you don't know this, the Hawaiian Islands sit on a geological hotspot within the Pacific Ocean. And so magma is coming up from the Earth's mantle. But at the same time, because of seafloor spreading and because of plate tectonics, the seafloor or the plate is sliding over this hotspot. And every time this seafloor spreads over this hotspot, magma comes up and forms an island. And then the seafloor continues to spread, and that island is left behind, and another island pops up, and another island pops up, and another island pops up. And if you look at the Hawaiian Island island chain, what we can see is that the islands to the west, the sort of smaller islands, are the older islands that were formed on this hotspot first. But then the islands, the seafloor took those islands away from the hotspot, and another island formed. And the seafloor took that island away from the hotspot, and then another island formed. And then as these islands are being taken away from the hotspot by seafloor spreading, they're eroding away. And that's why they're kind of smaller that's why the older islands are kind of smaller compared to the younger islands. So as it turns out, the big island of Hawaii is the youngest of the current Hawaiian islands. And maybe even a newer island is going to be formed at that hotspot in the future. But the point is that the sort of adaptive radiation of these Hawaiian honeycreepers is very, very tightly linked to the formation of islands in this chain. And so while there was a single ancestral species that occurred at one point in time, it was able to give rise to a group that colonized the first oldest Hawaiian island that we know of, at least at the moment. That group began to diversify as more and more islands became available for them to evolve within. More and more islands is kind of like saying more and more available ecological niches for these birds to diversify within. And in fact, in a relatively short period of geological time, basically throughout the lifetime of the Hawaiian Islands, we see that the Hawaiian honeycreepers have diversified into many, many species, kind of like we saw with the cichlids in Lake Victoria. And the older lineages of these birds evolved on older islands, and the younger lineages of these birds evolved on the younger islands. And this process has played out over geological time, and probably it's played out because not only have there been so many available ecological niches to these birds, but they've been able to acquire novel traits, novel innovations. So each time a new island forms and a subset of this ancestral honeycreeper population, let's say, for example, here, goes on to colonize one of those islands, these different birds are being selected for all kinds of different traits that allow them to have stable coexistence. And then this happens again as a subset of that population goes on to colonize yet a younger island. And via this whole kind of complicated process, we go from having one species to having many species. And so again, this is a classic example of an adaptive radiation. And as it turns out, ecological separation like this can really drive rapid adaptive evolution if the strength of natural selection is strong. And obviously, this is happening in multiple environments across the globe. But we have a really interesting example of this here in the California desert, where we have these pupfish. And you might be thinking to yourself, desert, fish in the same word? Wait, what's going on? How could there be fish in the desert? Well, as it turns out, there are multiple species of these pupfish that do occur here in the California desert. That's pretty interesting. What in the heck is going on? How is that happening? Where did these fish come from? Well, these fish are in the genus Cyprinodon, and the ancestor of these fish actually occurs in the Caribbean Sea. And if you don't know this, well, once upon a time, the Caribbean Sea was actually connected to aquatic water bodies here, or water bodies here in Western North America, because Western North America didn't always have deserts. It used to be a cooler, wetter environment long, long ago. And as it turns out, if you look at this map on the right, uh, following during the Pleistocene, which is about 15, 20, 25, 30,000 years ago or more, up into even 2 million years ago, this area that we currently call the Mojave Desert wasn't a desert. And it had this really intricate lake system. And if you've ever driven out into the Mojave Desert and seen dry lakes, what you're seeing are the remnants of this lake system. All of those dry lakes once were inundated. And in fact, many of them probably were connected via different river systems. And so the pupfish, whose ancestor occurred in the Caribbean Sea, had dispersed into Western North America when it was underwater. The water levels went down. There was a lot of geological change, geomorphic change over time, ultimately leading to the formation of this lake system. But the pupfish did well to survive within this lake system. Now, in about the last 10,000 years, this lake system has really kind of dried out. And at this point in time, there are only really a few locations across the Mojave Desert where there is still water. And of course, not surprisingly, that water is not particularly abundant. But there are springs and ponds and some artesian wells and a few streams that occur within the Mojave Desert where isolated populations of these pupfish still are found. Now, how does this relate to this concept of ecological separation and adaptive evolution? Well, as these pupfish were sort of isolated in different pools, different ponds, different streams, they began to diversify and diverge into different species. And this is probably happening for the same two reasons that we talked about. There are varied ecological niches, so not all of these ponds or pools or streams have the same ecology. And these different pupfish possess different adaptive traits that allow them to really exploit those different ecological environments. And so we've been able to go from having, or there's been a process where a single ancestral pupfish has colonized this area and subsequently diverged into multiple different species of pupfish. And this is a pretty interesting example of an adaptive radiation occurring in a rather extreme set of conditions. And here are some examples, some cartoon examples of what these pupfish look like. This is just a handful of species. There are other species as well. And we have males and females that have undergone some level of sexual dimorphism. But basically, these are separate species that have diverged in these sort of different environments, probably more or less via allopatric speciation. As it turns out, the diversification of this clade of Cyprinodon fish, these pupfish, has occurred pretty fast. How do we know that? Well, clever scientists have applied molecular data, DNA data. They have built a molecular clock to kind of figure out how many different mutations, different lineages of these pupfish share, and that is based on a known mutation rate. But basically, the idea is we can look at these different subspecies of pupfish, each represented with a different color in this plot. And what we see in this plot is that there is population structure. And I don't want you to get lost in what the heck is going on with this plot, but basically, these colors represent shared genes. So individuals who belong to Cyprinodon diabolus here are really kind of genetically distinct when compared to other individuals in this same analysis. And these different locations here on the bottom of this plot sort of indicate where those different species of fish occur. And so Cyprinodon diabolus occurs in a place called Devil's Hole, and those fish are kind of isolated in that very small aquatic environment, and they share genetic information with each other, but not so much with these other groups, like Myocentes. Myonestes, which shares a little bit of genetic information, probably from the deep ancestral past, but mostly these populations are really distinct from one another. Maybe these ones are kind of more similar to each other. Maybe they're still exchanging genes on some level, but there is this thing we call population structure. Different environments, different populations, and they have kind of diversified into separate species. We can look at this in a phylogeny here, and basically we have these same species we are looking at in this plot shown in the phylogeny. And of course, this phylogeny has time on its sort of x-axis. And what we see is the radiation of these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 species has happened in just 5,000 years. And so the ancestral population of Cyprinodon existed in this environment about 5,000 years ago, probably when water was a little bit more available. But at that point in time, the populations really started to become isolated into these different environments, each of these different environments. And as that happened, they started to undergo rapid genetic diversification. And again, this is probably happening because these environments are sort of variable in terms of the ecological niches that are available to the fish, and each of these different fish populations have probably evolved some slightly different adaptations to those environments. And so we see pretty rapid diversification occurring within these populations. I will point out that many of these populations are considered subspecies of another species of Cyprinodon called Cyprinodon nevadensis. But the point is we see very identifiable rapid diversification occurring via the process of adaptive radiation. Now, as it turns out, similar ecological niches can lead to convergent morphologies. And this is kind of an interesting process. And so we can get to this situation where we have separate ecomorphs. And basically, ecomorphs are certain types of adaptive characteristics that different individuals might possess that are very well suited to particular types of ecological niches in the environment. And probably one of the most classic examples of this we see comes from the anole lizards that occur in the Caribbean. And these anole lizards tend to have vertical stratification in their distribution and in the kinds of niches that they occupy. So for example, we might have 5 or 6 different types of ecomorphs of these anole lizards that occur. We might have grass bush anoles. So these anoles just live down lower in the canopy, and they're able to survive on the ground or in low bushes. We might also have trunk ground anoles. So these lizards will use the ground a little bit for habitat, but they'll also use tree trunks for habitat as well. That's kind of their niche. In turn, we have trunk anoles, and these lizards only occur on the trunks of trees. That is their niche. We also have twig anoles, and these anoles only occur on twigs. They don't really hang out on the trunk, and they don't really make it up into the canopy. That's their niche. We also have trunk crown anoles. So these lizards will use the trunk for habitat, and they might go up into the canopy somewhat, but that's their niche. These lizards aren't going down to the ground for resources. And then lastly, we have the crown giant. These are lizards that only really use the crown of the tree, the top of the canopy, for habitat, and that is their niche. So this is kind of similar to what we see with adaptive radiation. In one particular context, an ancestral species of anole lizard colonize this environment, and these different lizards have radiated into these different niches, and they have different traits that allow them to exploit those niches. The cartoon here kind of illustrates how different these lizards look. And as it turns out, grass bush lizards wouldn't do very well if you put them up on the crown, and vice versa. Crown giant lizards probably wouldn't do very good down on the ground. And so these lizards have been able to diversify into a multitude of niches that are available in the environment, and they were able to do so because they each have acquired novel traits that make them really well suited to using that environment for habitat. And so they have formed these different ecomorphs. Now, the crazy part of the story is this didn't just happen once, but it has happened on multiple islands in the Caribbean. And so this image on the right is a phylogeny kind of illustrating how the radiation of anolis lizards has played out on these different islands. And so these little cartoony looking shapes here are the different islands. And these, of course, are all the different lizards. And basically, the take home message for this is that Anole lizards who colonized Cuba underwent this process of adaptive radiation and evolved into these different ecomorphs. And then a completely different ancestral population of anole lizards colonized, say, an island like Jamaica. And this ancestral lizard was able to radiate into almost exactly the same set of ecological niches. Likewise, a different ancestral species of anole lizard colonized Hispaniola, and likewise was able to radiate and diversify into these different ecological niches. And this also happened in Puerto Rico. So we see a situation basically where this ancestral lizard exists here, has given rise to different lineages that have colonized different islands. And in each of these different situations, in each of these different environments, we see the same radiation into basically the same kinds of ecomorphs. This is pretty amazing. If we took a crown giant from Cuba and a crown giant from Puerto Rico and we looked at them, you might be very inclined to say, well, these are the same species. But as it turns out, and you might be inclined to say they must share their most recent common ancestor. But as it turns out, they don't. They share their most recent common ancestor much, much further back. It's just that the same pattern of adaptive radiation has unfolded on multiple occasions on different islands, because these different islands are kind of ecologically similar in terms of the availability of different niches. Excuse me. And so this is a really interesting process by which we're kind of seeing a form of convergent evolution. Similar environmental pressures on different islands, leading to the formation of very, very similar kinds of morphologies that we see amongst our anole lizards. So this is kind of the end of the story for this. The basic idea is that we know that species have niches, whether we describe those niches as roles they play in ecosystems or parts of ecosystems that they can occupy, or their tolerance to different conditions, different environmental conditions. It's directly related to their physiology. And that's really kind of driving the whole process that dictates where species can occur. And then the fact that if different lineages can acquire very novel characteristics, we call them adaptations, that they can undergo widespread diversification. And not only can it happen in a single environment like this, such as we see with the cichlids of Lake Victoria, we can also see it happening in different environments that just happen to have very, very similar niches. So that's kind of the story behind this, and that's going to be it for this lecture. I'll catch up with you next time.